Welcome to the Published Author Podcast, where we help entrepreneurs learn how to write a book and leverage it to grow their business and make an impact. I'm your host, Josh Steimle. Today, my guest is Trena White. Trena is the co-founder and principal of Page Two, an award-winning publisher of nonfiction books by entrepreneurs, subject matter experts, CEOs, and others. She's worked in book publishing for 20 years and has worked for big-name publishing houses such as Greystone Books and McClellan and Stewart. Trena, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Josh. I'm happy to be here.
So for the audience, I'm excited to interview you, Trena, because I wasn't familiar with Page Two before, or I should say, I got familiar with some of the books that your publishing house had published before I knew what Page Two was. And so when I saw Page Two's website and I was looking at books, I was like, hey, I know that book. I love that book. Hey, I know that book too. I love that book. And so I realized I've got to talk to somebody at Page Two and find out what they do, because a lot of the books coming out of your company are books that I really like a lot. So I'm excited for this interview today. So Trena, first off, give us a little bit more about your background. Who are you and what led to you becoming a publisher in the industry? Because that's not the type of thing, 5-year-old girls say when they're little is, hey, I want to be a book publisher someday.
No, it's not. Although in hindsight, it's not surprising that I became a book publisher, because when I was a 5 or 6-year-old girl, I did publish a little neighborhood newspaper and knocked on doors and went and sold it to my neighbors. I would write up the local news and sell it to them.
So I think it did start young.
I was always a book publisher at heart, or a publisher at heart for sure. As you mentioned, I've been in book publishing for about 20 years now. And I got my start. I had been working in various communications jobs. And then when it dawned on me that you actually could have a career making books, I thought that is the best thing I could ever imagine. And of course, that's what I should do. And so I did a program called the Master of Publishing degree at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. And that's what got me going in the industry. As part of that program, you have to do an internship. And so I went to Toronto and I interned at a company called McClellan and Stewart, which is now part of Penguin Random House. And it was an interesting time because the company was going through a lot of change, new publisher. They were also being purchased by Penguin Random House. So it was, there was a lot of upheaval and new leadership. And I ended up getting hired to work at the company, and then held a series of publishing jobs over the years on the editorial side of things. And then eventually moved back to Vancouver and worked for an independent publisher there. And then when that company entered creditor protection, my now co-founder and I started to talk about what we might want to do together. And we basically came up with a plan of starting our own publishing business. But since we'd been through that bankruptcy, and she had been through another one, we were cautious about it. And we knew that we needed to do something that was going to be a little bit different, not necessarily following the traditional model. We also felt that the kinds of authors we wanted to work with were entrepreneurial. They were the subject matter experts. And we felt that the traditional publishing model that we had been working in wasn't actually necessarily the best fit for the kind of authors we wanted to support. So we came up with a different kind of model and launched Page Two. It looked quite different then, 8 years ago when we launched it, than it does now. But our vision for the kind of author that we serve has stayed the same throughout. And it's really it's the kind of people you interview and you speak to in your podcast, really.
Mm-hmm. Now, Page Two is a hybrid publisher, correct?
It is a hybrid publisher. And,
so for those who aren't familiar with that term, explain to us what that is and exactly what that means for you.
Yeah. So hybrid publishing is quite a big catch-all phrase for this whole kind of middle ground of publisher that lies somewhere between self-publishing and traditional publishing. And generally what it means is that the author is investing in some way in the book and in the creation of the book. And then generally they earn more on the back end. So when the book actually sells, they earn more than they would in a traditional publishing scenario. I say generally because there's just, all kinds of variation out there in the hybrid publishing space. And in fact, to the extent that we have not typically used that phrase ourselves, because it's difficult to, we feel that we're bringing a level of professionalism that you don't always see in the space. And so the way we work is that our authors do pay us to produce their book and basically, provide this support that you would expect a publisher to provide. So handling editing and design and production and sales and marketing and distribution. And then we do not license their rights to the book. So they retain total ownership of the book content and their intellectual property, which is very critical because they are typically entrepreneurs and experts who are using that IP in all kinds of ways, as part of their business. The book is one expression of their expertise, but often they're running courses and training and doing speaking and so on. So that ownership piece is really critical for our authors. And then when their books sell, they earn 90 to 100% of the proceeds of the sale, depending on how it's sold.
You mentioned professionalism, and for me, what stands out is cover design. I've looked at a bunch of the cover designs from the books that you've done, and I think, well, these covers just look better than most of the covers I see out there coming from a lot of other hybrid and traditional publishers. But when you talk about a different level of professionalism, what else are you talking about in addition to that?
Yeah, it's really, thanks for your comments on the design. We do have a really, I'm really proud of our design team. They do great work for sure. But it's the rigor throughout the entire process. So that starts from the editorial work that we do with our authors to shape the concept of the book, because that's a distinction. We don't expect our authors to come necessarily with the idea fully formed and fully outlined. We will work with them to shape it. So it's the rigor of our editorial process, where we go through multiple rounds of substantive editing, really shaping the content and the structure and the stories and so on, and the idea, so that it communicates the author's intention to the best of their ability. And then, of course, design. It's the work we do on positioning the book for the market. So, it's one thing. We're basically working as a service provider to the author, but we also always have the reader in mind. We're trying to make a book that is commercially viable. And so we're quite rigorous about our approach to setting the book up for sale in the market and digging into title, subtitle, pricing, and all of those things that play into bringing the book to market. And it's just not the case that doesn't happen consistently in the hybrid space. We are quite unusual in our in that rigor.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So why should an entrepreneur / author, why should they consider working with a firm like yours versus going to a Penguin Random House or some sort of traditional publisher, assuming they could get that kind of deal, or just self-publishing and figuring it out on their own? Where's the value? What's the type of client that really gets the value out of the services that you bring that's the right fit?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say the benefit to working with us compared with self-publishing is that you're working with a team of true book publishing professionals. You know, many of our team members have worked at Penguin Random House or, you know, other traditional publishers. Many of them have won awards for their work. And so you get the benefit of having creative control over your book and ownership of your IP, but you don't have to learn everything there is to learn about book publishing in order to do it successfully. You've got a team that has your back really from beginning to end and is there doing the heavy lifting in partnership with you. The benefit of working with a company like Page Two versus a traditional publisher would be, it's really about the fact that when we work with an author, we're not thinking of the book just as an object that we're bringing to market for sale. We're thinking about how the book fits into the author's broader objectives. So we're really thinking about the author's goals for the book right from the beginning. How does the book support their business? How does it fit into the other products and services that are part of their business's ecosystem? What branding considerations are there as a result of that? What does that mean for the launch timing? These are all considerations that we make in tandem with the author because we really see the book as part of their broader business. So I think that is one of the big differences and the big, considerations. It's really about, it's a model, how we think of it is a model of partnership and collaboration, where I had an author actually say to me just last week, she said, I get what you're doing. It's not a parent-child relationship that you have with your authors. It's a peer-to-peer relationship. And that's really how we approach it, where the author is right with us, making decisions about the book at every single stage. So, when we design a cover, for instance, since you commented on our design process begins with a focused design meeting with the author, where we talk to them about their brand and about their aesthetic values and, anything that we should know about what would make sense for them to see reflected on the cover. And then, of course, we're also looking at what are the conventions of the category and how do we make it stand out on Amazon as a thumbnail and all of the things that you consider as you design a book cover. But it really starts with a conversation with the author about their vision for that. And then we go away and come back with usually about a dozen different cover directions as a very first starting point. In a traditional publishing scenario, when I was an editor working for traditional publishers, we would just deliver to the author one cover, and we'd say, here's your cover. We really hope you like it. Our sales
here's your
team,
book.
Here's your cover. Sales loves it. Marketing loves it. And we hope you do too. And then if you don't, then, the conversation can become a bit tricky. And the author doesn't have a lot of power in that conversation, really. So it's just, I use that example just to show that we really kind of, the author's right with us along the way, developing the book. And that's the big difference. That's not going to be for everybody, but for a certain kind of author, that is really appealing.
Yeah, and I can appreciate that because when I published my first book, they provided me a cover design. My publisher gave it to me and I looked at it and I said, oh, this kind of looks like a textbook or something. Can we work on this? And thankfully, they were willing to work with me, but there was a process there. And it would have been very easy for me to just say, well, they know what they're doing and they're the experts. But I was thankful that they were willing to engage in some give and take and give me a say in what the cover looked like.
Yeah, I mean, that's ideally how it goes, even in a traditional publishing arrangement. But most traditional publishing contracts specify that the publisher has the sole authority to finalize the price, the title, the marketing plans, the cover design. And so you're just starting right off at the offset with there's a power imbalance, really. And so we've also been working with quite a lot of authors who have worked with a traditional publisher and have decided for a variety of reasons that they want to do it a different way the next time around. And often it is that desire for creative input that they're choosing, but it also is about the earnings, because even though you pay for our services, it's an entrepreneurial undertaking, right? The author's basically investing in their work, and if it does well, they stand to earn much more over the long term than they might through the advance that they would get and the subsequent royalties that they would get in a traditional scenario. Of course, it depends. If you're, a big name, household name business book author, then that's a different story, perhaps. But a lot of them say, you know what, I'm not earning what I think I should be earning off my book sales. And so I want to publish in a model where I have the opportunity to actually make a bit more off of it.
At what point would you tell a client or a potential client coming to you, at what point would you tell them you really should go work with a traditional publisher? That's the right fit for you. Or is there any point at which you would say that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I often say that more to fiction authors, and we don't publish fiction, but I actually think for literary fiction authors, traditional publishing is the way to go. For authors who are writing, books that are an expression of thought leadership, for the entrepreneurs and the subject matter experts who are writing business books and personal development books and so on. Once you reach a certain profile, for me, it does get a bit hard to, it would be a bit hard to recommend a traditional publishing scenario. I feel like you really can have the best of both worlds. And so it would be rare, I think, for me to make that recommendation.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Now, why would you say that fiction might be a better fit with traditional publishing? What's the difference between fiction and nonfiction that makes that a different bit of advice from you?
Because I think fiction depends on, it's harder to build a community. It's harder to build a following around literary fiction unless you've been out doing it for a while. Whereas with nonfiction, you can build an audience well in advance through all of the other things you're doing to support your business, right? And people come to you as an expert on a specific topic, which is just a very different thing from fiction.
Yeah, I see exactly what you're saying there, because if you're out speaking and consulting and doing things, you're building up an audience, you're building up a platform there, and you can build up a platform through blogging or social media or all these things. But it's not like J.K. Rowling could have gone out before she published Harry Potter and say, hey, join my email list because I'm going to write this great book someday.
Yeah, it's very difficult. And so I think fiction authors rely more on the kind of marketing and sales and distribution that you can see through a traditional publisher, access to literary awards and things like that can increase exposure for them. But I also want to be clear that I come from a traditional publishing background, right? And I have total respect for that part of the industry. It's just for the entrepreneur who's out building an audience and a platform, I really feel that a hybrid direction can make a lot more sense.
Mm-hmm. Great. Can you walk us through some case studies of clients that you've worked with? Yeah. I know for my part, I really loved one of the books I read first that came out of Page Two was Exactly What to Say by, I think, Phil Jones, right?
Yeah.
And I read that book, and it's a very different book. It's very short. It's a very quick read. And for that reason, I read it 4 times in 2 days, because I read it and I finished it. I was like, oh, well, that was so quick and that was so good. I'm just going to read it again. And then I read it again. And then the next day I read it again. And I thought, this is a fantastic book. And it's so quick and short. It's like a different way of looking at a book. I don't know if you can speak to that one directly, but I would be curious to know behind the scenes, like what went on with that book, because I suspect there might have been some give and take or negotiating going on behind the scenes where somebody was saying, he may have been saying, I want this to be really, really short. And you were saying, are you sure you want it that short? Or
Yeah, I think there are a couple things to unpack there. And the first is that one of the things we're becoming known for at Page Two is shaking off some conventions that don't necessarily make sense anymore, given the way books are sold. And we have published a number of quite short books, including Exactly What to Say, The Coaching Habit, and The Advice Trap by Michael Bungay Sr. All three of those books are less than 30,000 words, whereas a traditional business book is usually, 60 to 80,000 words. So they are very, very short. And that's deliberately so. First, to make them easy to read for their business books, for people who may not have a lot of time, or they have a lot of competition for their reading time and their media consumption time. It's also really the belief that there's no reason a book has to be 60 to 80,000 words. That is really an older convention that comes from publishers believing that a book needs to have a spine of a certain width so that it stands out and is visible on a bookstore shelf. But now we live in an environment where, the majority of books are bought online. So that tradition doesn't necessarily make so much sense anymore. And so in that case, with Exactly What to Say, it was really, it actually, Phil Jones had originally self-published quite a different version of that book years earlier. And then he came to us. He completely rewrote the content. So it was all new content, but similar concept, which he had tested in a self-published version and saw that there was a market for it, an appetite for it. It was, 25 key phrases anyone can use in a conversation to be more persuasive, basically, is what the book is. And it's just so functional. It's the kind of book a salesperson can refer to quickly before a conversation. We designed it in a way that it has lots of pull quotes and sidebars. And so you can just dip into the text really at any point. You don't even need to read it in a linear way necessarily. Our creative director, Peter Cocking, would say that kind of design, it's great for people who aren't necessarily book readers, right? They want the information, but they're not necessarily somebody who's going to sit down and read 300 pages from beginning to end. So it was designed very deliberately that way. And one of the interesting, in addition to the length, one of the really interesting things about the strategy for Exactly What to Say is that Phil has done, he has sold tens of thousands of books through bulk sales, because he's a sales trainer. And so he does a lot of speaking and so on, and has sold his book in bulk to many of his clients over the years. And we've done many adaptations of it to customize it for specific clients. So for instance, he sold 10,000 copies to a photography association, and we put the photography association's logo on the cover. They have a message from the head of the organization in the front of the book. And then Phil actually changed examples throughout the entire book to be photography specific. And so we've done probably about a dozen different custom editions for that book over the years for specific sectors and specific clients of his. So it's another way, because he owns the rights to the book, he can play with the material in quite creative ways that serve his goals, his broader corporate goals.
That's great. And I need to get him on the show so I can ask him this next question, but can you speak at all to the success that he's seen in his business as a result of that book?
Yeah, I would love to hear what he would say about that. To me, watching him run with this, I think the success of the book I think it would be hard to parse the impact the book had on his business, because the book and his business are so intertwined. So, for instance, the year that we launched Exactly What to Say, his keynote that he was delivering was called Exactly What to Say. And so the keynote was selling the book was selling the keynotes. And it was just this kind of mutually reinforcing system. But he's now sold almost 1 million copies of this book. And so it's,
Wow.
it definitely has worked by any measure, I would say.
So how do you keep up with that kind of demand, or how is that handled? Like, how do you handle the printing process of his book, for example? Is that something that you work with printers exclusively, or was this a print on demand book, or how do you handle that?
So with that book, we actually initially set it up for sale through print on demand. And for people who aren't familiar with what that means, basically, you can make a book, set up the files and the data for a book online, and that gets fed out to Amazon and other online bookstores. And then when a consumer buys the book gets printed up virtually overnight and then shipped out to them. So it's both a printing and distribution method. And from the reader's perspective, it's just a book. It doesn't look any different. Their purchasing experience is no different. It's just a difference in manufacturing more than anything. So we initially set his book up in that way, and then it started to take off, and we saw, okay, there's a bigger demand here. And so we switched to a different distribution mechanism, which is called trade distribution, where the book is printed in advance, it's shipped to warehouses, and then sold into the whole book trade. So physical stores as well as online stores, libraries, specialty stores, and so on.
Quick break here. Are you an entrepreneur? Do you want to write a book that will help you grow your business? Visit publishedauthor.com, where we have programs to fit every budget, programs that will help you write and publish your book in as little as 90 days, starting at just $39 per month. Or if you're too busy to write your book, we'll interview you and then write and publish your book for you. Don't let the valuable knowledge and experience you have go to waste. Head on over to publishedauthor.com to get the help you need to become a published author. You've already waited long enough. Do it today. Now, back to the show. And what is the advantage of doing trade publishing, or why do you go there at a certain level of sales?
I would say it comes back to what the author's goals are. So when we talk about their sales and distribution strategy, it really depends on what their goals for the project are and where their audience is likely to be found. So for instance, for some of our authors, they want to get a book into the market as fast as they can. Maybe there's a specific event that they want it to be released for. And print on demand is a better option for people who need to move quickly, because the cycle to create the book, basically the production timeline is shorter and the distribution timeline is shorter too. So that would be one reason you might go in that direction. For somebody like Phil Jones, the idea was, okay, we see it selling through Amazon really well. This might tell us that there's a much broader market out there. And if we were to put it into brick and mortar stores, what could we do with this? Maybe there's an opportunity to sell it through Barnes and Noble, through libraries, and other places. So we thought we would try to expand his reach to the extent that was possible. And that was why we made that switch. Our books are distributed by a company called Macmillan, which you'll be familiar with, but it's one of the large multinational publishers, and they take on select smaller publishers for sales and distribution. So they sell our books. And they are able to open up opportunities that are new. For instance, they've just sold one of our business books into FedEx locations across the US. That's the kind of opportunity that you don't see through print on demand sales.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Now, with IngramSpark, you get some more distribution than you would get with Amazon. You can get some library, you can
Mhm.
get some other distribution, but what's, can you tell us about some of the finer details? What's the difference between trade publishing and like an IngramSpark that kind of sits in between Amazon and trade?
Yeah. The thing with IngramSpark is, yes, you can set, and we use IngramSpark for people who want to publish their book through print on demand. We'll set books up for sale on IngramSpark. But there isn't a sales team that comes with IngramSpark. That's really the big difference, right? You're the sales team because you're trying to drive people to buy your book online, for the most part. Yes, libraries can buy your books, but there isn't somebody out meeting with libraries and pitching your book to them, which is what happens when you sell your book through a company like, Macmillan, through a sales team. They have a sales team of over 100 people that meets regularly with Amazon, but also library wholesalers and the full extent of the book market. So that's the difference. It's the creation of new sales opportunities. Print on demand is more passive, isn't the right word, because you still have to be extremely active with your marketing, but it's more consumer facing marketing, whereas there's this whole B2B marketing that happens with the trade.
Right. So you could go with IngramSpark and you could see all this additional distribution, but essentially you're going to be doing the sales yourself if you want to take advantage of those channels.
Yeah.
If you're a self-publishing author.
That's right. I mean, and the reality is that most bookstores, basically you have to make bookstores aware that your book exists if it's on IngramSpark. How do you let them know it exists? You also have to set up a discount for them that reduces your earnings on sales of the book. So yeah, there's just some different things to consider as you decide on that strategy.
Yeah, and I interviewed. Sorry, go ahead.
For the most part, I would say if you're using IngramSpark, you almost pretend that you just think that you're not selling to brick and mortar. It's just not going to be a significant part of it.
Yeah, I interviewed somebody who actually did go into individual Barnes and Noble stores and got them to buy the book. But I mean, they had to do this one at a time, and maybe they hit up 5 or 10 of them, and they got them to buy some books. But of course, that took time and effort and work, and most authors are not going to want to do that.
Exactly. Yeah, anything's possible, but how much energy do you want to put into that?
Yeah.
And local bookstores are always really happy to support local authors too. So if you're self-publishing your book or using tools like IngramSpark, probably you can go to your local bookstores and get them to take it on. But the kinds of authors we support just typically wouldn't have a lot of time or energy to do that.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about international and foreign language distribution? Is that something that you handle as well?
Yeah, we do. So our books are sold internationally through Macmillan and in Canada through an equivalent company called Raincoast, but that's the English language edition. We also have a network of about 25 agents in countries around the world that sell translations to our books. So, they're in their countries and they know the publishers and editors in their countries and pitch our list to the right people in their countries. So we've sold, really all over the world and had our authors' books translated into many different languages. We basically feed these agents information about, any news that we have about the book, we feed to them to try to stoke interest in translation deals. And exactly what to say has been sold in something like 15 to 20 languages now, for instance.
That would be an interesting book to translate, because a lot of things to say you don't say them the same way in other cultures or languages. You can't just use Google Translate to do that job for you.
It's true. And of course, with the translation, the author he could run the translation through Google Translate to see how it checks out, but he has to really trust that the publisher buying the rights is translating it effectively. It's hard to check the nuances.
Yeah, that's a tricky business.
Yeah.
Well, this is great. So, are there any other case studies that might be especially relevant for our audience of entrepreneur authors as they try to launch their books and get their books out there, or they consider your services? You mentioned the coaching habit. That's another one of my favorites. And I was pleased to see that that was a book that you guys put out. But are there other case studies that you feel like are especially relevant?
Yeah, I would say somebody who comes to mind is an Australian woman named Joey Remini. And she is a specialist she's an entrepreneur who specializes in tinnitus and vertigo. And we published her book, Rock Steady, about 6 months ago. And because she has built a following and an audience over the years, she has thousands of people who participate in her Facebook groups, for instance, and who've taken her courses. She has different tiers of courses and things. When we launched that book, she sold 7,000 copies in the first week. Because she had just such a committed audience. And so I mention that because I think that's really one of the big keys to success for a nonfiction author. It's all about thinking about how you're building that audience and the following and the marketing that you're doing years before the book even launches. Just trying to find ways to connect with your audience so that when the book exists, you can engage them, and amazing things happen when you do that.
That's fantastic. So I know the question every listener has on their lips is, how much does this cost if I work with Page Two? And I know it's different depending on the mix of services that people hire you for, but do you have a range, like a minimum and maximum or average, that you generally tell people to expect if they engage your services?
Yeah, it's typically between $30,000 and $40,000, and then plus printing costs if we're actually printing physical books and warehousing them, and then depending on what marketing we're doing for the book, there may be some additional marketing costs. So we do talk through the project and the author's needs, individually, and come up with a plan for each individual author. But I would say that's a rough range. And so, it's not going to be for everybody. It is a significant investment. There's no question. And I would say we tend to be a fit for a more established entrepreneur who will often see it as part of their marketing budget, or part of the cost of running their business.
Mm-hmm. Other than the people who can't afford the service, who are some of the other entrepreneur authors that are not a fit, that you might say, you know what, this might be a great book, it's just not a fit for Page Two? Yeah,
it really tends to be people who are fairly new in their businesses. So still, the authors we work with are what we think of as subject matter masters. So people who have really been working in their category and on their topic for many years and have really become well known for whatever it is that they do. And so it's people who have, recently left a corporate career and have launched their own business, and maybe they're in year 1 or 2 and still trying to figure out exactly what their niche is and who their market is and so on. Those people typically, it would be rare for us to work with somebody who's really quite new in that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Fantastic. Can you tell us briefly, what's the company look like in terms of structure, headcount? Like, what type of people do you have working there with you?
Yeah, we are 17 people now. So it's my co-founder, Jesse Finkelstein, and I, and then a team of salespeople, marketers, editors, and designers. For the most part, we're based in Vancouver on the west coast of Canada, but we are, of course, all working remotely now. We have team members in Toronto. We have an editor in New York, and we work with people across North America and around the world. We've had some European authors as well.
Mm-hmm. And about how many books do you put out per year?
We're publishing it's between 40 and 50 a year. Yeah.
Great. Just curious, with COVID hopefully coming to an end here soon, do you plan on going back to the office and having everybody back in the office, or have you gotten addicted to working from home and you think it's kind of nice?
Well, so I'm in a bit of a different position because I live in a small community called Roberts Creek, and you have to take a ferry to get to my town. So I have been commuting in 2 days a week before COVID anyway. And really, we've always allowed our team to work remotely if that's their preference, and many people do. I think after COVID, it's just going to be a hybrid setup where people can choose to go into the office if they want to, choose to work from home. We've actually hired 5 people since September, so we've grown a lot during COVID. And now our office is too small, so we're not really in a position to have all 17 people in the office at one time anyway. But I don't think many people are going to want to go in 5 days a week now that everybody's used to working from home. So they'll sign up for desk space. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah. Have you seen any changes in the publishing industry more broadly because of the pandemic?
I guess the biggest change has been, I would say, I don't feel there's been a dramatic change, but a few patterns have accelerated. And most notably, the increase of digital book sales. So people are buying their books online, and brick and mortar retailers have adapted to online sales too, even independent bookstores. And this website, bookshop.org, which is effectively almost the independence version of Amazon, if you will, has grown exponentially and is one of the big success stories of COVID. So many more online book sales, and then digital formats of books are also selling at greater numbers than before. So audiobooks and ebooks are seeing double-digit growth. Ebooks had pretty much plateaued before COVID. They're growing a little bit, but audiobooks have increased exponentially over the last year in terms of market share. So those are the big changes, I would say. Nothing that I think basically we've seen probably 5 to 10 years of growth in those areas in the last year and a half.
That's interesting because it might turn out to be a blessing in disguise for these independent bookstores, because it's hard to adjust to slow change sometimes. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it takes a shock and then you say, oh my goodness, I need to go do this right now. And those changes that they've made might be what saves them and helps them. And it might be the fact that it was such an abrupt shock with all retail closing down that they said, hey, we have to go online, we have to do more of this, but that might in the long run end up benefiting them.
Yeah, it might. It's hard to say. A lot of the independent bookstores are saying that online sales for them are extremely labor intensive and time consuming. So to have to, go pull the books off the shelves and have somebody packaging them up, they're just not well equipped for that in the way that Amazon is with its, hyper efficient warehouses. But at least it's a possibility now, and they know how to do it now. And I bet we'll continue to offer it as a service. And so, yeah, we'll see. We'll see where things land in the next few years.
Yeah, it will be interesting. Well, Trena, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to be here on the podcast. The website is page2 with 2 spelled out.com, correct?
Yes.
Is there anywhere else that people can connect with you online?
They can connect with either me directly or with Page Two on LinkedIn. And Page Two is also on Facebook and Instagram if people want to look there.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for being with us here today on the Published Author Podcast.
Thanks so much, Josh. I appreciate you having me.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to spread the word, please give us a 5-star rating review and tell your friends to subscribe too. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else you listen to podcasts. And if you're an entrepreneur interested in writing and publishing a nonfiction book to grow your business and make an impact, visit publishedauthor.com for show notes for this podcast and other free resources.